The ancient shaman's prophecy came true. Sky beings arrived from the east. Men, white like ghosts. Game trails became footpaths, became trade routes and highways. The white men would bring about more change to the backbone of the world in 200 years than the Shining Mountains had seen in 20,000. It's challenging to fly safely through the mountains, but when I look down below and imagine crossing the Rockies overland 200 years ago, the prospect is overwhelming. Reaching the mountains, the explorers entered an unknown three-dimensional maze of cold rushing water, fallen timber, rock and ice. What they discovered was that any profits from the Great Lone Land would be hard won. I continue my flight along the backbone of the world in a region of the Rocky Mountains known as Y to Y, Yellowstone to the Yukon. We'll meet people who are devoting their lives to better understand this place. Together, we'll explore how the world discovered the Rockies. In the Alberta foothills, on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, one of the great prairie rivers, the Saskatchewan, emerges from the mountains. During the fur trade, this ribbon of water was the gateway to a land of riches.
We're in actually one of the original corridors going back 200-300 years for the early European explorers coming up here with their native hunting parties to haul the mail, haul supplies up to Jasper House from Rocky Mountain House.
Richard Smith was one of the last RCMP officers to patrol the mountains by dog team. He's been retracing the fur trade routes in the old style.
Man has been using dog teams now for over 6,000 years. And it goes back to our northern native people over in Siberia, and then the migration routes over to North America, and then the Inuit people. The dog teams were quite small years ago because the more dogs you had, the more care, handling, more feed. Everybody ran on snowshoes and broke trail in front of the dog teams. They ran beside the dog teams, and they would haul all their supplies, 200, 300 pounds of gear, and so they couldn't afford to ride on the back. Nowadays, the dogs are a little better trained, especially in voice commands, so you can be on the back and pedal instead of being out front all the time.
That's it, boys. Come on. The fur traders called the toboggan their winter canoe. I doubt if anyone in modern times has seen as much whitewater pass beneath his skids as Richard.
A lot of times you'd have one or two guides out front breaking trail for the dog teams, and then within an hour the dog teams would follow up. And they didn't really have a good breakfast until they were on the trail. And again, you're talking pemmican, you're talking dry meat, beef jerky, you're talking a lot of bannock, and then of course hunting en route. And if you didn't find game en route, then you'd end up getting into some slim pickings, and you could almost starve while out on the trail, because you have to feed the dogs first and then yourself. The women are really the backbone of helping you get across the country. Yeah, the men were the hunters and the guides, but really if it wasn't for the women, they would have had great difficulty having the tools and the clothing and the transportation to get from point A to point B. And the European who did not adapt to the native way of life was the one that perished. So it was very important that the family went with you, because you just couldn't leave people for 3 months, 9 months while you went off and did your thing. So the family came with you. It actually made for a more efficient and effective trip. Everybody took turns breaking trail. Everybody would take turns hauling supplies and equipment, gathering firewood, setting up camp, getting food ready, repairing equipment and clothing so they could start out early the next day. And it became a very close-knit way of exploring our great West Country. You know, I wish we could go back in time to see the uncut land and look at the landscape and then look to the west and see those great mountains, the snow-capped peaks, the rock, you know, the backbone of North America. That Rocky Mountain Cordillera must have been some exhilarating moment for somebody to see that for the very first time.
"200 years ago, the fur trading companies were competing for a commercial route to the Pacific. The challenge, of course, was to find a path through the mountains. In 1807, a mapmaker named David Thompson, working for the Northwest Company, would finally chart a viable way across the Great Divide. Historian Brian Patton and I follow Thompson's historic map to the confluence of the North Saskatchewan and Howes rivers.
This was the easiest pass. They used other passes, but this was a popular route. Canada was explored so much more quickly to the Rocky Mountains than the United States because of the rivers, which were the superhighways of the day. And this is just about the furthest point up here on the house, just over this bluff, that any canoes ever made it into the Rocky Mountains, any fur trade canoes. This was the first big logistical problem across Canada. The rivers and portages were relatively insignificant till you got to the Continental Divide.
The men, women, and children in Thompson's party faced an even greater problem once they reached the higher mountains. There was no reliable source of game. They ran the risk of running out of food.
Yeah, and it was hard to hunt here. I mean, they'd see sign of these animals, but they very seldom could find anything. And they virtually were starving in this particular area, aside from one skinny black bear that stuck its head into Thompson's tent up on the house and got shot for its efforts. Yeah, I mean, the first thing a fur trader had to do, whether it was Mackenzie or Thompson or whatever, when they moved into new territory, find the locals and beg trade for food.
It seemed they did a lot of begging.
Well, and they often did some complaining, too, at what they would have to pay for a scrap of food. But when you're out there in the middle of nowhere and you're not even quite sure where you are, then the price goes up. What's the big bird down there? Osprey?
Yeah.
I don't know if I ever saw osprey up here. Should have, I guess. Huh.
Brian reckons this is where David Thompson made camp for 2 weeks in June of 1807. That's Howes River down below, and Howes Pass in the distance, where they were headed as soon as the snows melted. The interlude gave Thompson time to work on his great map, which even by today's standards is considered remarkably accurate.
The scale of today.
I brought my GPS from the plane. I think Thompson would have found a GPS fairly handy.
Oh, yeah. He was born 200 years too early, I guess.
Okay, so we're going to come up 51, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 57 across to here. And then you can come up 16. So we're saying here 116.46, which would bring us right about into there. and down, so it's all coming in
Right
to...
near the confluence of those rivers, yeah. I don't know. I would find that pretty accurate, considering some of the things that he was dealing with. And there's the thunder of avalanches with
Well, you can see the avalanche
right there,
falling
coming off the cliff on Sarback. And these were the things that he noted. They would have heard a lot of this in June, you know, and especially when you have maybe a little bit warmer day than today. He didn't do, you know, a lot of celestial readings on these trips. This was one of the few places where he was sitting in one place long enough. You had to, well, let's look at today, you know, and maybe tonight, if these clouds would hold in, why, how do you do any kind of readings? And you get day after day of this sort of cloudy weather, and particularly in June when he was here.
Thompson considered himself more a surveyor than an explorer. Clouds or no clouds, he succeeded in mapping over 1 million square miles of North America.
But it's remarkable to think that it was just a white sheet of paper.
Yeah.
Without anything on it, and that he... How long did it take him to make this map, the Great Map?
I think it was a couple of years after he retired he worked on it. Yeah, I can't remember the exact time, but it was a long, tedious job, and of course, it was part of his final, you know, it's like when you've finally terminated a job and you still got that one thing hanging out that you have to get done for your employers so that you can retire. And that was sort of what Thompson was up against.
By 1793, Mackenzie had already reached the Pacific by land, and Canadian fur traders had mapped much of the Northwest. Americans Lewis and Clark owed the Canadians a debt of gratitude as they gained information from their journals. They reached the Pacific even ahead of Thompson.
In 1800, the order had been given through the hierarchy of the Northwest Company to cross this mountain range and establish a post on the western slope. And two voyageurs were sent across to winter with the Kootenai Indians. They come back in the spring with a young Kootenai boy who is bringing them back and then going to take the first trading party over to the Columbia and his tribe. But he's jumped by a band of Stoney Indians, and the Kootenai boy is killed. And it's another, what, 6 years before they're able to cross the Rockies. But if you look at that moment in time, if that Kootenai boy hadn't been killed in a silly skirmish when he emerges on the east slope of the Rockies, if that party crosses the Rockies and establishes a post in 1801, it's pretty conceivable that Canadian fur traders would have welcomed Lewis and Clark at the mouth of the Columbia four years later. That's kind of an interesting thing. I've often thought about that, you know. How did the world discover the Rockies? We discovered the Rockies, the world discovered the Rockies through maps. This would have been the first images. Through words. Then the painters, and then eventually in the 1870s and 80s, the photographers. So this was the sort of slow revealing of this mountain range to the world.
Slow to start, perhaps, but once the Canadian dream of connecting east with west was realized, it was full steam ahead. Building a transcontinental railway was about getting through the mountains and uniting a country. It was about luring British Columbia into Confederation before the Americans did. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway through the mountains of Western Canada remains one of the greatest engineering feats in the world. It wasn't until the railway pierced the wilderness that the West opened to tourism and settlement. Europeans and Eastern Americans had little wilderness left at home, and the possibility of visiting the western frontier was exciting. My son Jesse and I jump at the chance to take a ride on a restored CPR steam train.
Well, I'm glad you came today.
Yeah, I'm glad I did too. It's a lot of fun. Get to see what it looks like.
We join author and historian Bob Sanford and his kids on a trip back in time.
That is Major Albert Bowman Rogers. He was an early surveyor. He was considered to be the toughest surveyor and traveler in the entire mountains, and Rogers Pass is named for him. He was also known as Old Blue Thunder. He'd take a chaw of tobacco, a can of beans, and disappear in the mountains for days.
Nice beard.
How do you think your dad would look with a beard like that?
Mutton chops.
Not that great. No. Bob, when was it the first train came through here?
The first complete train came through this area in November of 1885, so about 119 years ago. And at that time, the railway had so little money that it had to take a very, very direct route down Kicking Horse Pass on what was called the Big Hill. And it was the most dangerous section of the railway line, the steepest and the most difficult. And here engines had to be put on the head of the train and the tail of the train to push and pull the train up the steep hill through this particular region before the spiral tunnels were built. This was the most famous part of the Canadian Pacific Railway line. Well, it's fascinating when you look at how this was actually done. You would have an advanced army of not just surveyors, but people who worked to clear and lay the railway bed and lay the tracks. And the railway camps were quite substantial, cities in their own right. So you see this advancing army moving through the west, laying down a track that was effectively a highway. And the change in the perception of the west, which was virtually unknown, was dramatic and almost immediate. The Canadian Pacific Railway knew what was here. They knew it was a land of spectacular and diverse richness. And they were able to sell to the world the notion of taking the Northwest Passage across Canada by train and stopping in spectacular, virtually unexplored places en route. The railway advertised 1,100 unclimbed mountains in the Canadian West. So people came from Europe and from the eastern United States and eastern Canada to try their hand at mountaineering. And an accident at Lake Louise in 1896, where a lawyer from Boston fell off Mount Lefroy, stimulated the railway to bring the first of the professional Swiss mountain guides to the Rockies. And what they did is they took regular hotel guests who rode on the train west and turned them into mountain climbers. They brought a whole range of things. They first of all brought a whole new attitude toward mountains because they knew how to climb them safely. You didn't have to die in the mountains if you knew how to climb and how to watch for weather and how to use safe techniques. They also brought fascinating new clothing with them. Fashion, check the high water pants, climbing in ties and jackets. With fedoras, these were gentlemen climbers. And the people who climbed with them were generally people who were just as sophisticated as they were.
The Great Divide is one of the most spectacular natural features in Canada. The continent's not flat. There's one broken high spine in the west. On one side, all the water flows into the Pacific, and on the other, all the water flows into the Atlantic at Hudson's Bay. And the train goes right across this spine.
When you see where they picked the railway route, it goes through landscapes that most Canadians and most North Americans didn't even imagine existed. They were landscapes of aesthetic power that were beyond timelessness. These were the very essence of what the world was made out of. And it was breathtaking. It was stunning to be able to sit in an armchair and actually move through a landscape this exotic, this dangerous, this amazing.
The CPR launched an ad campaign that couldn't fail. If you're tired of climbing the Alps, they said, come and climb a virgin peak. Or, if you prefer, paint one. The Canadian Pacific Railway recruited artists to come west and set up their easels along the rail line to create artwork for their advertising campaigns. In the art world, they became known as the Railway School. Art historian Lisa Christensen brings me to Lake O'Hara, one of the scenes immortalized by those early artists.
So the railway really opened up the West, and the railway artists brought it to the attention of the rest of Canada and the world. And William Cornelius Van Horn was great patron of the arts in Canada by commissioning artists, sending them out to paint along the rail lines, having them come to places like Lake O'Hara to create scenery that sure was advertisement, but really they brought this wonderful part of the world to everyone's attention. Depending on how intrepid they would go into the backcountry. Some worked right along the rail lines, like John Ennis and Thomas More Martin. Others came here in the late 1880s, which was quite something to come this distance and paint. And to this day, actually, we still are discovering things from the railway school that we didn't know. It's a great area of Canadian history that we're still learning an awful lot about.
Lake O'Hara became a favorite haunt for the Group of Seven, the most famous artists Canada had produced.
We're just coming up on one of J.H. MacDonald's favorite painting spots. Nice little point sticking out in the lake where you get a grand view. This is where J.H. MacDonald would have been in 1924 when he did this little study. It's a great little study. It's full of energy, full of movement. You can see the glacier on Cathedral. Looks pretty much the same as it does today. Great reflection, great movement in the lake, charged sky. And I love how MacDonald let his panel show through. In many instances in the Lake O'Hara sketches, the wood shows through and becomes part of the composition and reads as rock surface or as sky, as clouds, various different kinds of things. The people who lived here really knew the area better, and they knew when things would be happening in the mountains. They knew the height of the larches, when it would be. They knew when the breakup was, all those kinds of little subtle details. Whereas the painters, Group of Seven primarily, although A.Y. Jackson and J.H. MacDonald were exceptions to the rule, they wanted the great big soaring peaks. They wanted the grand shot that summed everything up. And they weren't as interested in the little details of nature. I think that beauty spots gain reputation very quickly, and Lake O'Hara has the best reputation, absolutely, without question. Even above Lake Louise, Lake O'Hara is the spot to come for artists.
I envy the painters. They seem able to capture a spiritual presence that many of us feel in these mountains, but find so hard to articulate. In the 1880s, the vacationing Vaux family from Philadelphia arrived on the CPR and were captivated by what they saw. Their photographic record of the Illecillewaet Glacier in Rogers Pass amounts to the first scientific observations of the Rockies.
Between 1894 and 1939, there was a member of the Vaux family in the Selkirks or the Canadian Rockies every summer.
Henry Vaux Jr. is renewing the family tradition of mountain photography. Walking among the old foundations of Glacier House, one of the first great CPR hotels, it's obvious that much has changed in the last 100 years.
My family first came to Glacier House in 1887. The people who came were my great-grandfather and his 3 children. They came here almost quite by accident on the CPR and stayed at Glacier House for several nights and wandered around and looked at the glaciers and took photographs. 6 years later, they came back, and when they walked out to the nose of the Illecillewaet Glacier, they were struck by how far it had receded in just the 6 years since they had been there.
Joining Henry on a search for the site of his grandfather's observations is biologist Dan McCarthy. Carrying on the scientific work of the early Vauxes, Dan dates the retreat of glaciers by studying lichens. As ice vanishes, the lichens begin to grow.
The significance of the Vaux family, from my perspective at least, is that they were the first people in Canada to study an active glacier in a systematic way. They came back year after year, starting 1887, and photographed from the same rock, Rock W on their detailed map. What impressed me the most, I suppose, initially was the beauty of the photographs. This particular site at the Illecillewaet Glacier is the best documented, photographically, the best documented retreat of glacier ice in North America.
It occurred to me one night at the dinner table that it would be interesting to go back and reshoot some of those pictures 100 years later. Last year, Dan, we came up here without you in a group. You were supposed to be here following your instructions and tore all over the side of this mountain trying to find the rock. And I suppose when we got back, we had 3 or 4 candidates, and one of them is coming up ahead, where we stood around and argued for a long time.
Well, this one here, you mean?
No, I mean the one up there, this one here.
Well, this was nice and flat. The position's just about right.
Let's just run up the trail and have a look at that one, just to satisfy ourselves that we've got the right one. Let's be scientific.
Henry Jr., like his grandfather before him, is a distinguished scientist.
Well, this one is certainly one of the candidates.
Oh yeah, this is my bet.
Let's see what the picture looks like.
Here we go. Here's the test picture number 2 from Rock W, and okay, I'm gonna get a shot, I think. Now, if I put on the 100mm lens, we'd see something a little bit different. There. The ice went up and was sort of a plateau just below where it is today. Notice up here there aren't any trees. and today you can see them right up on that col.
That something like a tree has colonized that in what, 103 years. It's just, there's been so much change. It's amazing.
One thing hasn't changed in 103 years. The call of adventure still draws mountaineers from around the world to challenge the most dangerous peaks. By the 20th century, 3 railways had been hammered into the mountain interior, chateau-style hotels were erected, and the Rockies were open for business. Painters, scientists, hunters, and climbers competed to name, define, and conquer a mountain wilderness. It was a golden era of exploration and adventure. Photographers and filmmakers like Byron Harmon worked hardest of all to reveal to the world views from the highest summits. These landscapes had never been seen before. They invited the world to discover the Rockies. In the early 1900s, additional European mountain guides were imported to meet the booming demand for adventure. Cutting steps up peak after peak for their international clientele, hundreds of first ascents were claimed. This was the beginning of adventure tourism. But one mountain would not be easily conquered. The summit of Mount Assiniboine is over 3,600 meters above sea level and rests on a base some 80 square kilometers in size. It's one of the world's great mountains. At the turn of the 20th century, it was known as the Matterhorn of the Rockies. It shared a striking resemblance to the icon of the Swiss Alps, and it had gained a similar reputation of being unclimbable. Much has changed in 100 years, but Mount Assiniboine remains a serious challenge. I imagine the early mountaineers sharing the feelings of mountain guide Barry Blanchard and climber Bonnie Hamilton.
I was taught, like a lot of folks, that we fit at the very top drawer of the environment, that we're in control of pretty much everything. And I think one of the great values of this environment is you come in and you learn pretty quick that you're a lot of notches down from the power of what's going on around you. And I think it takes one real storm on a mountain for you as a human being to realize how very, very small you are in this environment. And when it's storming, when the atmosphere is unleashing on these big mountains, how ineffectual anything that you do is. It's a drop in a tempest, you know. So I think those kind of experiences are valuable for human beings, period. To anything that makes you a bit more humble and lets you realize that you're part of something that's far bigger than you are. We're pretty arrogant as a species, and it's good to have our, you know, get us kicked around every once in a while.
I think about it every time I go out. Definitely it's in the back of my mind. Being a mom is a big responsibility, and I take it very seriously. But I need to do my own thing and have some adventure and some excitement in my life, and this is what I love to do, and I think it makes me a better mom. It's what makes me happy, is being up here in the mountains. The thrill of it all and the adventure, and going out and doing these things and not knowing what the outcome will be.
Continuing the long tradition of mountain filmmaking in the Rockies, we've waited patiently for clearing weather to climb Mount Assiniboine. We spend our first day checking out our gear and scrambling to warm up for the challenge ahead. Pat Morrow and his assistant Roger DeBear are operating second camera on this shoot. Pat is truly a modern explorer. I've long admired his camera work on the world's highest peaks.
The Rockies, for me, were a perfect training ground to learn how to keep myself and my camera alive in a hostile mountain environment. And I've been able to apply the many lessons that the Rockies have taught me on expeditions to most of the other great ranges of the world. What I'm after is the personal experience of being there to witness that event or to witness that beautiful scene. And the photography and filmmaking really is a byproduct for me. You know, if the picture turns out and people are excited about it, you know, because it communicates to them, then I'm really pleased with that. But I keep telling people these photographs or this film footage can only represent a single dimension of the mountain experience. In order to get that total experience, you have to go there yourself to witness it. So I'm only the messenger.
Tomorrow we'll tackle Mount Assiniboine, where some of the best climbers have lost their lives in winter conditions like these. We'll start well before daybreak, but even then, we'll be hard-pressed to reach the summit and return before nightfall.
So everyone's got helmets, headlamps I can see, sunglasses, sunscreen, got extra gloves, harness, tools, ice axe, got water, got a rope, got a rack. Everyone's packed their courage.
Yeah,
good.
In our pack.
We'll need the courage.
We're attempting an ascent of Assiniboine's North Ridge. Frigid air bites our nostrils. Darkness amplifies the sound of strong winds higher on the mountain. Everyone's quiet, anticipating the long climb ahead. The rising winter sun brings no warmth, and the multicolored dawn warns of unstable weather. I'm concerned for the safety of our team. Pacific storms have recently layered the mountain with fresh snow, and prevailing westerly winds have cross-loaded the North Ridge, creating dangerous wind slab avalanche conditions. Like plates sliding off a tilting table, wind slabs will be a danger on the upper ledges of the mountain.
People often ask you what's it like to be up on these big mountains when a storm's breaking loose, or to do some of the harder routes, and it really is like a small lifetime. It's just so rich and intense and alert and alive, and in the moment there is consequences to your actions. And I've always found that as you address a risk, there's often the voice of fear rises inside of you, and a lot of what climbing has done for me is taught me how to control fear.
wind, it's going to be cold enough to get frostbitten here, so we'll have to keep an eye on each other with it, especially our faces.
Okay.
It'll be real easy to get a blanched nose or blanched cheeks, and that's the first sign of blood leaving the skin, and then the skin will start to freeze. So if you see that on me, let me know. I'll do the same for you.
Hypothermia is one of the greatest risks in winter mountaineering. Prolonged exposure to cold temperatures and high winds gradually lowers the body's temperature, numbing the mind and impairing a climber's judgment. In an environment like this, there's little room for error. Maintaining a slow, steady pace and staying fed and watered are crucial to conserve the energy needed to stay warm.
Hey, he holds me up on this one.
The earliest mountaineers would never have considered climbing Mount Assiniboine in conditions like these. They were more than tough enough, but they lacked the technical gear and winter climbing experience to survive up here.
There isn't life without risk. It's just part of life. We are pretty fragile entities, and it doesn't take much to injure or kill us. You know, you willfully go up into these situations where risk is amplified, and that to take life for granted is a huge assumption a lot of the times. Perhaps the purpose of risk is just to wake you up to the fact that what a gift of life is, and I guess to hang on to it as best you can.
We never actually conquer a mountain. We essentially survive, and by the grace of the gods come back home again. The ancient ones traveled on foot. 200 years ago, a few fur traders arrived on horseback. In 1901, the first mountaineers stood on this summit. Then, with the railway and automobile, inroads to the wilderness began in earnest. Now, big industry competes with recreation to profit from these mountains. And the gods in their infinite patience continue to grace us. But for how long?
200, 300 pounds of gear, and so they couldn't afford to ride on the back. Nowadays, the dogs are a little better trained, especially in voice commands, so you can be on the back and pedal instead of being out front all the time.
That's it, boys. Come on.
The fur traders called the toboggan their winter canoe. I doubt if anyone in modern times has seen as much whitewater pass beneath his skids as Richard.
A lot of times you'd have one or two guides out front breaking trail for the dog teams, and then within an hour the dog teams would follow up. And they didn't really have a good breakfast until they were on the trail. And again, you're talking pemmican, you're talking dry meat, beef jerky, you're talking a lot of bannock, and then of course hunting en route. And if you didn't find game en route, then you'd end up getting into some slim pickings, and you could almost starve while out on the trail, because you have to feed the dogs first and then yourself. The women are really the backbone of helping you get across the country. Yeah, the men were the hunters and the guides, but really if it wasn't for the women, they would have great difficulty having the tools and the clothing and the transportation to get from point A to point B. And the European who did not adapt to the native way of life was the one that perished. So it was very important that the family went with you, because you just couldn't leave.
The prospect is overwhelming. Reaching the mountains, the explorers entered an unknown three-dimensional maze of cold rushing water, fallen timber, rock and ice. What they discovered was that any profits from the Great Lone Land would be hard won. I continue my flight along the backbone of the world in a region of the Rocky Mountains known as Y to Y, Yellowstone to the Yukon. We'll meet people who are devoting their lives to better understand this place. Together, we'll explore how the world discovered the Rockies. In the Alberta foothills,
people for 3 months, 9 months, while you went off and did your thing. So the family came with you. It actually made for a more efficient and effective trip. Everybody took turns breaking trail. Everybody would take turns hauling supplies and equipment, gathering firewood, setting up camp, getting food ready, repairing equipment and clothing so they could start out early the next day. And it became a very close-knit way of exploring our great West Country. You know, I wish we could go back in time to see the uncut land and look at the landscape and then look to the west and see those great mountains, the snow-capped peaks, the rock, the backbone of North America. That Rocky Mountain Cordillera must have been some exhilarating moment for somebody to see that for the very first time.
"200 years ago, the fur trading companies were competing for a commercial route to the Pacific. The challenge, of course, was to find a path through the mountains. In 1807, a mapmaker named David Thompson, working for the ancient shaman's prophecy came true. Sky beings arrived from the east. Men, white like ghosts. Game trails became footpaths, became trade routes and highways. The white men would bring about more change to the backbone of the world in 200 years than the shining mountains had seen in 20,000. It's challenging to fly safely through the mountains, but when I look down below and imagine crossing the Rockies overland 200 years ago, on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, one of the great prairie rivers, the Saskatchewan, emerges from the mountains. During the fur trade, this ribbon of water was the gateway to a land of riches.
We're in actually one of the original corridors going back 200-300 years for the early European explorers coming up here with their native hunting parties to haul the mail, haul supplies up to Jasper House from Rocky Mountain House.
Richard Smith was one of the last RCMP officers to patrol the mountains by dog team. He's been retracing the fur trade routes in the old style.
Man has been using dog teams now for over 6,000 years. And it goes back to our northern native people over in Siberia, and then the migration routes over to North America, and then the Inuit people. The dog teams were quite small years ago because the more dogs you had, the more care, handling, more feed. Everybody ran on snowshoes and broke trail in front of the dog teams. They ran beside the dog teams, and they would haul all their supplies.